The red sands of Varkes. Nine howled like a dying beast. Inside the rusted husk of an abandoned mining station, Ryde Tanner sat in the dark, his breath shallow. The air reeked of old oil and regret. He wasn't hiding from the world. He was hiding from himself. From a name they used to scream across the battlefield, Shadowblaze. Once he burned fleets to cinders with the power surging through his veins. Now, he was just a man running from the ashes. Until tonight, a distant crash echoed through the station, metal groaning under force. They'd found him. Through a cracked monitor, he saw them. Xyrak hunters, hulking figures wrapped in bio-armored carapace. Their red eyes pulsed like embers, scanning the halls. And then he saw her, a Xyrak female, her armor peeling away in smooth, organic plates. Beneath, her shimmering skin gleamed like black opal, muscles rippling with predatory grace. She ran her hand down her side, checking her gear, slow, deliberate, sensual. Ryde swallowed hard. For the first time in years, something other than fear throbbed inside him. But there was no time for that. They were hunting Shadowblaze. And Shadowblaze wasn't dead yet. Want to see what happens when a forgotten legend rises again? Hit that subscribe button and join the fight. The war on Varkes 9 has only begun. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Let's light the galaxy on fire. The dust never settled on Varkes 9. It hung in the air like a curse, swirling around the rusted husks of mining rigs abandoned decades ago. Ryde Tanner leaned back in a creaking chair inside his makeshift shelter, a crumbling shack pieced together from scavenged metal and cracked glass. At 32, he was a man carved from hard years, broad shoulders, a chest thick with muscle, a jaw shadowed with stubble that hadn't seen a blade in weeks. His gray eyes, sharp as a blade's edge, stared out through a grimy window at the endless red wasteland. This was his exile, his punishment for a past he couldn't fully recall. Only flashes of fire, screams, and the roar of starships tearing apart under his command. He cracked open a warm can of synth brew, the bitter tang hitting his throat as he swallowed. 3 years on this rock, hiding from the galaxy, and he'd almost convinced himself he was nobody. Almost. The scars crisscrossing his knuckles told a different story. Marks of a warrior who'd once held the power to burn fleets to ash. They called him Shadowblaze back then, a name whispered in awe and fear across the star lanes. Now, he was just Ryde, a ghost in the dust. A low rumble snapped him out of his thoughts. The ground vibrated beneath his boots, subtle at first, then sharper, like the growl of something alive. He set the kin down, hand drifting to the crude plasma cutter strapped to his thigh. Out here, visitors meant trouble. And trouble on Varkes 9 didn't knock politely. The shack's door exploded inward, metal screeching as it hit the wall. 5 figures stormed in, Xyrak mercenaries, their hulking frames encased in bio-armor that pulsed with faint green light. Insect-like mandibles clicked beneath their helmets, and their clawed hands gripped neural rifles. Shadowblaze, the leader rasped, voice distorted through a translator. You're a hard man to find. Ryde didn't flinch. Wrong guy, he said, voice rough but steady. I'm just a scavenger. You got the wrong rock. The leader tilted its head, mandibles twitching. Lies don't suit you, human. The neural core in your chest says otherwise. Hand it over, or we rip it out. Ryde's hand tightened on the plasma cutter. Neural core? He didn't know what the hell they were talking about, but the mention of his chest sparked a flicker of unease. Before he could respond, a second Xyrak stepped forward. A female, smaller but leaner, her armor peeling back slightly as she adjusted a scanner. The biosuit slid down her torso, revealing a glimpse of slick, glistening skin that shimmered like wet oil under the dim light. Her curves were sharp yet fluid, alien yet hypnotic, and as she bent forward, her clawed fingers brushed against her own thigh, tracing a slow, deliberate line that sent a jolt through Ryde's gut. His breath hitched, a primal heat stirring low in his body despite the danger. She didn't notice his stare, or maybe she did, but the sight burned into him, raw and electric. Enough games, the leader snarled, raising its rifle. A bolt of blue energy seared past Ryde's head, shattering the window behind him. That was all the push he needed. He moved like a storm breaking loose. The plasma cutter flared to life, a blazing arc of light slicing through the leader's arm. Green blood sprayed, sizzling on the floor as the Xyrak howled. Ryde ducked low, rolling under a second blast, and drove his fist into another merc's gut. The bio-armor cracked under the blow, a sickening crunch echoing as his knuckles met alien flesh. He didn't know where the reflexes came from. Years of exile hadn't dulled them, but his body remembered war like an old lover's touch. The female Xyrak lunged, claws slashing. Ryde caught her wrist, twisting hard, and for a split second, their bodies pressed close. Her skin was cool and slick against his, her breath hissing through mandibles inches from his face. Up close, her scent hit him, sharp, musky, like rain on scorched metal. His pulse hammered, a dangerous mix of adrenaline and something darker tightening his grip. She snarled, wrenching free, but not before her tail flicked against his leg, a teasing graze that left his skin tingling. He didn't have time to process it. The third Xyrak fired, a needle-tipped dart streaking through the air. Ryde twisted, but it grazed his chest, right over his heart. Pain flared white-hot, and then something else. A pulse, deep and alive, erupted inside him. He staggered, clutching his shirt as a faint glow flickered beneath the fabric, radiating from a spot he'd never noticed before. The neural core. It hummed, a living thing waking up, and with it came a flood of fragmented memory. Standing on a starship bridge, hands clenched on the controls, a wave of fire consuming an enemy fleet as his voice roared the order to strike. "What the hell?" he muttered, voice thick with shock. The glow pulsed brighter, and the Xyrak froze, their scanners beeping frantically. "It's active," the female hissed, her four-fingered hand hovering over her comms. "Take him now." Ryde didn't give him the chance. He grabbed a rusted pipe from the floor and swung, smashing it into the leader's skull. The Xyrak crumpled, bio-armor sparking. The female charged again, but he sidestepped, slamming her into the wall. She slid down, dazed, her armor retracting further to reveal more of that glistening skin. Smooth, taut, stretched over muscle that flexed with every ragged breath. Ryde's eyes lingered a second too long, a raw hunger clawing at him as her chest rose and fell, her body pinned beneath his shadow. He shook it off, turning to the last merc. Too late. A second dart hit him square in the chest, dead center where the glow burned brightest. Pain exploded, sharper this time, and the core flared like a dying star. His vision blurred, knees buckling as the shack spun around him. The female Xyrak's voice cut through the haze, cold and triumphant. "He's ours. Signal the ship." Ryde hit the ground hard, dust choking his lungs. The last thing he saw was her silhouette looming over him, claws glinting, her tail swaying slow and deliberate like a predator savoring its catch. Darkness swallowed him, but the heat in his chest, and lower, lingered, a promise of something unstoppable waking up inside. Ryde Tanner woke to the hum of engines and a sharp, wild scent that didn't belong to Varkey's Nine's dust-choked air. His head throbbed, a dull ache pulsing behind his eyes, and his chest burned where the Xyrak dart had struck. He blinked, vision clearing, and found himself sprawled on a metal slab inside a ship. Sleek, curved walls glowing with faint blue light, nothing like the junk heaps he was used to. The air was cool, tinged with something earthy, almost alive, like a forest after rain. He tried to sit up, but straps pinned his wrists and ankles tight, cold steel biting into his skin. "Easy, human," a voice said, smooth and low, with a strange musical edge. "You're not dead yet." He turned his head, and there she was, leaning against a console a few feet away, arms crossed, watching him. Sylvara Keen. She wasn't human, that much was clear. Her skin shimmered green, like fresh leaves catching sunlight, smooth and taut over a body that was all lean muscle and sharp curves. For eyes, red as glowing embers, locked onto him, unblinking, set in a face both fierce and haunting. Long, pointed ears twitched slightly, catching every sound, and her dark hair spilled over her shoulders like ink. She wore a tight bodysuit, black and glossy, hugging every inch of her alien frame, leaving little to the imagination. Ryde's throat tightened, a flicker of heat stirring low in his gut despite the straps holding him down. "Who the hell are you?" he growled, voice rough from disuse. "And why am I tied up?" She stepped closer, boots silent on the metal floor, her hips swaying with a grace that felt deliberate. "Name's Sylvara Keen. Bounty hunter. Save your ass back there when those Xyrak goons were about to carve you open." She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. "As for the straps, you're a wild card, Ryde Tanner. Or should I call you Shadowblaze?" His stomach dropped. "That name again. I don't know what you're talking about." "Let me go." "Not yet." She leaned over him, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her green skin. Her scent hit him harder now, wild, primal, like crushed herbs and something sweeter, darker. One of her hands brushed his chest, fingers hovering over the spot where the glow had flared back in the shack. "This thing in you? It's alive, and it's worth a fortune." Her nails grazed his shirt, light but electric, sending a shiver down his spine. "I need to know what I'm dealing with." Ryde clenched his jaw, fighting the heat creeping up his neck. Her touch was too close, too deliberate, and those 4 eyes pinned him like a predator sizing up prey. "I'm not your damn prize," he snapped. "Untie me, or I'll break these straps myself." She smirked, lips curving just enough to show a hint of sharp teeth. Big talk for a man flat on his back. Her fingers lingered a second longer, pressing down where the neural core hummed beneath his skin. A jolt shot through him. Not pain, but something hotter, deeper, like a spark igniting dry tinder. He sucked in a breath, and her ears twitched, picking up the sound. "Interesting," she murmured, voice dropping low. "It likes me." "Get off," he said, but it came out weaker than he meant, his body betraying him as her closeness stirred something raw. She straightened, stepping back with a knowing look, and hit a switch on the console. The straps clicked open, releasing him. Ryde sat up fast, rubbing his wrists, glaring at her. "You've got 5 seconds to explain why I shouldn't snap your neck." Sylvara didn't flinch. "Because I'm the only one who knows what's waking up inside you." She tapped the console, and a hollow screen flickered to life, showing scans of his chest, a glowing orb embedded deep, pulsing like a heartbeat. "That's a neural core. Old tech. Dangerous tech. And it's tied to you, Shadowblaze, the man who torched half the Hector cluster in a single strike." His head spun. Hector cluster. The name hit like a punch, dragging up a memory he didn't want. He was on a bridge, hands gripping a control panel, stars blazing outside a massive viewport. "Fire," he'd barked, voice cold as steel, and a wave of white-hot energy had ripped through the void, swallowing enemy ships in a sea of flame. Screams echoed in his ears, then silence. Thousands gone in seconds. He'd been untouchable, a god of war. Shadowblaze. He shook it off, glaring at Sylvara. "That's not me anymore. I'm done with that life." "Life doesn't care what you want," she said, stepping closer again. This time, she didn't stop until she was inches away, her green skin catching the blue light in a way that made it shimmer like liquid. "The Xyrak weren't random grunts. They were hunting you. Hunting this." She pressed her palm flat against his chest, right over the core. The heat flared again, sharper, racing through his veins like liquid fire. His breath caught, and he grabbed her wrist, intending to push her away. But he didn't. Her skin was cool under his grip, smooth as silk, and her 4 eyes softened, just for a moment, like she felt it too. "What are you doing?" he rasped, voice thick with something he couldn't name. "Testing you," she whispered, leaning in until her lips hovered near his ear. Her pointed ears brushed his cheek, a feather-light tease that sent a shiver down his neck. "You're not just a man, Ryde. You're a weapon, and I need to know if you're mine to wield, or if I should run." His grip tightened, pulling her closer without thinking. Her body pressed against his, firm yet yielding, and that wild scent flooded his senses, drowning out reason. Her ears twitched again, tickling his skin, and one of her lower eyes flicked downward, catching the way his chest heaved. "Careful," she breathed, voice a low purr. "You're waking things up you might not control." He wanted to shove her back, to break whatever spell she was weaving, but his body had other ideas. The core pulsed harder, syncing with his racing pulse, and a golden glow spilled through his shirt, lighting up her green skin in a way that made her look almost unreal. Her lips parted, a soft gasp escaping, and for a heartbeat, he imagined closing the gap, tasting that wildness on her tongue, feeling those curves melt into him as the ship faded away. The moment shattered when the console beeped, a red alert flashing. Sylvara pulled back, her ears flattening as she spun to the screen. "Damn it," she muttered. "They've tracked us." "Who?" Ryde stood, shaking off the haze, though his skin still burned where she'd touched him. "Xyrak. Bigger ship this time, and they're not here to chat." She hit a series of controls, the ship lurching as engines roared to life. "You're with me now, Shadowblaze. Whether you like it or not." "Don't call me that," he snapped, but the name echoed in his head, pulling up more fragments. Standing tall in armor black as night, a fleet at his command, power surging through him like a storm. He'd been more than a man once. A lord, a destroyer, Blaze Lord. Sylvara shot him a look, all four eyes glinting with something between amusement and hunger. "Get ready, human. You're about to find out who you really are." She brushed past him, her hip grazing his thigh, a deliberate tease that left him clenching his fists to keep from grabbing her again. The core pulsed, alive and hungry, and as the ship rocked under the first enemy salvo, Ryde felt it stirring too, a beast waking up, ready to burn everything in its path. The ship jolted hard, metal groaning as the engines screamed under strain. Ryde Tanner braced himself against the wall, the faint blue glow of Sylvara's cockpit casting jagged shadows across his face. The neural core in his chest hummed, a restless pulse that matched the chaos unfolding outside. Through the curved viewport, stars streaked past in a blur, but something darker loomed ahead. A massive Xyrak warship, its hull bristling with jagged spines and glowing green veins of biotech. It dwarfed Sylvara's sleek craft, a predator closing in on prey. "Hold on," Sylvara Keen shouted, her four red eyes darting between controls. Her green hands flew across the console, fingers dancing with a speed that belied her calm tone. Her pointed ears twitched, catching every creak and whine of the ship as it dodged a barrage of energy bolts. The bodysuit hugged her frame tighter under the tension, outlining every curve of her alien body. Lean, powerful, and impossibly alive. Ryde's eyes flicked to her for a split second, a flicker of heat stirring despite the danger. She was a storm in motion, and he couldn't look away. "What the hell is that thing?" he growled, gripping a support beam as another blast rocked them sideways. Sparks flew from a panel overhead, showering the floor in fleeting bursts of light. "Trouble," Sylvara snapped, not sparing him a glance. "Xyrak heavy cruiser. They don't send those for small fry. Someone really wants that core in your chest." Her voice carried a sharp edge, but her lips twitched with a smirk, like she thrived on the chase. Ryde's jaw tightened. The core pulsed again, hotter now, sending a ripple of energy through his veins. He didn't know what it was fully, only that it tied him to a past he'd buried deep, a past of fire and ruin. Shadowblaze, Blaze Lord, names that echoed in his skull like ghosts clawing their way out. "Then let's give them something else to chase," he said, stepping toward his secondary console. "You got weapons on this rust bucket?" Sylvara shot him a look, two of her eyes narrowing while the others stayed locked on the screens. "Rust bucket. This is a Venari stealth runner, human, fastest in its class." She hit a switch, and a hollow display flared to life beside him, showing twin plasma cannons and a missile bay. "You want to play gunner? Be my guest. Just don't blow us up." He didn't waste time. Sliding into the seat, he gripped the controls, the interface syncing with a low hum. The targeting system painted the Xyrak ship in red, crosshairs dancing across its spines. His hands moved on instinct, too smooth, too sure for a man who'd spent years scavenging dust. Muscle memory kicked in, sharp and brutal, like a blade slicing through the fog of exile. He squeezed the trigger, and a volley of plasma streaked through the void, slamming into the cruiser's flank. Green sparks erupted, but the beast barely flinched. "They've got shields," Sylvara muttered, yanking the ship into a tight spiral. "Hit the dorsal vents, weak spot. Now!" Ryde adjusted, firing again. This time, the plasma punched through, a fiery bloom ripping along the cruiser's spine. The ship shuddered, but a deep, grinding roar echoed through the comms, a sound that wasn't mechanical. It was alive. The hollow screen flickered, and a figure appeared, towering and monstrous even in projection. Draxon Vile. The Xyrak warlord filled the frame, his bioarmor a grotesque fusion of flesh and metal, glowing with sickly green veins. Mandibles snapped beneath a helmet studded with jagged horns, and his voice rumbled like thunder through a storm. "Shadow Blaze," Draxon snarled, the name dripping with venom. "You can't hide from me. That core belongs to the collective, and I'll tear it from your corpse if I must." Ryde froze, the warlord's words slamming into him like a fist. The core flared brighter, a golden glow seeping through his shirt, and another memory clawed free, standing on a burning deck, facing a Xyrak fleet, his hands dripping with blood as he unleashed hell. He'd fought them before. He'd won. "You're late to the party," he shot back, voice steady despite the chaos. "I don't even know what this thing is, but I'm not handing it over." Draxon's mandibles clicked, a sound like bones breaking. "Ignorance won't save you. Surrender, or I'll take your little green pet first." The projection shifted, zooming out to show Sylvara's ship in the cruiser's sights, a targeting lock painting them red. Sylvara cursed under her breath, her ears flattening as she banked hard. "Bait. I'll shove that horn up his." The ship lurched again, cutting her off as a missile grazed the hull, tearing a gash in the outer plating. Alarms blared, red lights bathing the cockpit in an eerie glow. She spun to Ryde, for eyes blazing. "Keep shooting, human. I'm not dying for your damn relic." He didn't argue. The cannons roared again, plasma hammering the cruiser's vents. Each hit sent tremors through the beast, but it kept coming, relentless, its spines glowing brighter as it charged weapons. Ryde's hands tightened on the controls, sweat beading on his brow. The core pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat, and a strange calm settled over him. Familiar, deadly. He'd been here before, in battles bigger than this, commanding fleets that turned skies to ash. The memory hit hard. A Xyrak armada crumbling under his orders, their screams swallowed by the void as he stood unshaken, a god of war. "Ryde!" Sylvara's shout snapped him back. "Focus, or we're scrap." He gritted his teeth, lining up another shot. This time, the plasma struck true, a vent exploding in a shower of green fire. The cruiser listed, wounded but not down, and Draxon's roar crackled through the comms again. "You think this ends me? I'll hunt you to the edge of the galaxy, Blaze. That power is mine." The warlord's image vanished, but the cruiser fired back, a beam of green energy slicing through space. Sylvara yanked the ship aside, but the edge of the blast clipped them, rocking the cockpit. Ryde slammed into the console, pain flaring across his ribs, and Sylvara stumbled, catching herself against the wall. For a moment, the chaos paused, the ship drifting as debris floated past the viewport. Ryde pushed himself up, chest heaving, the core's glow pulsing wildly now. He turned to Sylvara, who was already back at the controls, her green skin glinting with a thin sheen of sweat. "You okay?" he asked, voice rough. She shot him a glare, two eyes narrowing while the others scanned the screens. "Do I look dead? We're not out of this yet." Her fingers flew across the console, rerouting power, but the ship groaned, engines sputtering. "That hit took out our stealth drive. They'll lock on again soon." "Then we fight," Ryde said, standing straighter despite the ache in his side. The core burned hotter, a fire spreading through him, waking something he couldn't name. He stepped closer to her, drawn by that wild scent. Herbs and heat, sharp and intoxicating. You said I'm a weapon. Let's use it. Sylvara turned, her 4 eyes locking onto his. For a heartbeat, the air between them thickened, charged with something beyond the battle. Her ears twitched, catching his ragged breath, and her lips parted slightly, a flicker of curiosity, or hunger, crossing her face. "Careful what you unleash, human," she said, voice low, almost a purr. "You might not like where it takes us." Before he could answer, the hollow screen flared red again. The cruiser was closing fast, its spines glowing with a new charge. Draxon wasn't done. Ryde gripped the cannon controls, the core's energy surging through him like a tide. Whatever he'd been, Shadow Blaze, Blaze Lord, it was waking up now, and he'd drag this bastard down with him if it came to that. The cockpit trembled as the Xyrak cruiser loomed closer, its green spines pulsing with a sickening light. Ryde Tanner's hands tightened on the cannon controls, the neural core in his chest blazing like a trapped star. Every shot he fired lit up the void, plasma tearing into the enemy ship's wounded flank, but it wasn't enough. Draxon Vile's war machine kept coming, relentless, a shadow swallowing the stars. Sylvara Keen's voice cut through the noise, sharp and urgent. "Ryde, hit the core relay now. It's their power hub." He didn't question her. The hollow display zoomed in, highlighting a glowing nodule nestled between the cruiser's spines. His fingers danced over the controls, instincts from a buried life taking over. Shadow Blaze, the warlord who'd turned fleets to dust. He squeezed the trigger, and a final salvo roared out, a streak of fire that punched through the relay in a blinding explosion. The cruiser shuddered, green light flickering, then dying as chunks of bioarmor spiraled into the black. For a moment, silence gripped the cockpit, broken only by the hiss of cooling metal and their ragged breaths. Ryde slumped back, sweat stinging his eyes, the core's glow dimming to a faint flicker beneath his shirt. He'd done it, bought them time, but the victory felt hollow. Draxon's words echoed in his skull. "I'll hunt you to the edge of the galaxy." This wasn't over. Sylvara spun from her console, her green skin slick with sweat, 4 red eyes glinting in the red-tinged light. "Not bad, human," she said, voice rough but laced with a grin. "You've got a killer's touch." She stepped closer, boots clicking on the floor, her bodysuit clinging to her like a second skin, damp and taut from the fight. The wild scent of her, herbs and heat, hit him again, stronger now, curling into his lungs like a drug. He stood, wincing as his bruised ribs protested, and met her gaze. "Had to. You were about to get us toasted." His tone was gruff, but his eyes betrayed him, lingering on the way her chest rose and fell, the green sheen of her skin catching every flicker of light. She noticed. Her pointed ears twitched, a slow, deliberate motion, and 2 of her eyes narrowed while the others softened, a predator playing with its catch. "You're hurt," she said, closing the gap. Before he could argue, her hands were on him, one gripping his shoulder, the other pressing against his side where the blast had thrown him. Her touch was firm, cool against his overheated skin, and a jolt shot through him, sharp and electric, waking the core again with a faint pulse. "I'm fine," he muttered, but his voice came out thick, unsteady. Her fingers slid lower, tracing the edge of a bruise, and he sucked in a breath, the sting mixing with something hotter, deeper. She was too close, her face inches from his, her eyes locking onto him with an intensity that pinned him in place. Her ears brushed his jaw, a feather-light tease that sent a shiver racing down his spine, and that scent, God, that scent, flooded his senses, drowning out the smoke and metal. "Fine, huh?" she murmured, lips hovering near his ear, her breath warm and tingling. "You're a bad liar, Ryde." Her hand lingered, pressing just hard enough to make him tense, and her tail, long, whip-like, flicked up, grazing his thigh in a slow, deliberate stroke. The contact was fleeting but burned through him, a raw, primal heat pooling low in his gut. He clenched his fists, fighting the urge to grab her, to pull her against him and see how far that wildness could take them. Sylvara, he rasped, her name a warning or a plea. He didn't know anymore. The core pulsed again, syncing with his racing heart, and a golden glow spilled out, bathing her green skin in light. She gasped, soft and quick, her ears quivering as the energy brushed her, and for a heartbeat, her guard dropped. Four eyes widening, lips parting like she felt it too, a current binding them in the wreckage. The moment broke when a faint beep cut through, a distress signal, weak but insistent. Sylvara pulled back, tail snapping away, though her eyes lingered on him, dark with something unspoken. Later, she said, voice husky, a promise wrapped in a threat. She turned to the console, pulling up the signal source. It's a rebel outpost. They're close, and they're in trouble. Ryde shook off the haze, dragging a hand through his hair. Rebels? What's that got to do with us? Everything, she shot back, her tone hardening. That core in you? It's not just a weapon. It's a leash. The Xyrak want it, Draxon wants it, and the HFY who put it there will kill to keep it under control. The rebels might know how to break it. She paused, her eyes flicking to him. Unless you'd rather let that thing turn you into their puppet. He stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. A leash. The core pulsed, a reminder of the power, and the cage he carried. And you think they'll help me? A stranger? They'll help us, she corrected, stepping closer again, her tail brushing his leg once more, lighter this time, teasing. How about friends there? And after what you just did to Draxon's ship, they'll see you're worth keeping alive. Her lips curved, a smirk that dared him to argue. Besides, you owe me now. Oh, you. He raised a brow, but the heat in his chest and lower didn't fade. She was trouble, this greenskin hunter, and he was too deep to back out. For saving your ass twice, she said, turning back to the controls. Strap in, Shadow Blaze. We're jumping to the outpost before Draxon sends reinforcements. The ship hummed as she punched in coordinates, engines winding up for a hyperspace leap. Ryde sank into the gunner's seat, the core's glow fading, but its presence undeniable. He didn't know what waited at this outpost, or what Sylvara really wanted from him. But one thing was clear. The fight was just beginning, and she was dragging him into it, body and soul. As the stars blurred into streaks outside, he couldn't shake the feel of her touch, the promise in her eyes, or the fire waking inside him. Wild, dangerous, and his to claim. The hyperspace jump ended with a jolt, the stars snapping back into focus outside the viewport. Ryde Tanner gripped the armrest of the gunner's seat, his chest still buzzing from the neural core's restless hum. The fight with Draxon Vile's cruiser lingered in his bones. Every blast, every near miss, and that wild, electric moment with Sylvara Keen after the dust settled. Her touch, her scent, the way her green skin gleamed in the cockpit's glow, it clung to him, a distraction he couldn't shake. He glanced at her now, her four red eyes fixed on the controls, pointed ears twitching as she guided the ship toward a jagged asteroid floating in the void. There, she said, voice steady but tight. Rebel outpost. Haven's Hold. Last free rock this side of the galaxy. Her green fingers tapped the console, zooming the display to show a hollowed-out asteroid, its surface scarred with blast marks and dotted with flickering lights. If anyone knows how to crack that core in you, it's them. Ryde nodded, though unease gnawed at him. And if they don't, what then? Sylvara turned, two eyes narrowing while the others studied him. Then we figure out ourselves, Shadow Blaze. Her lips curved, a flicker of that teasing smirk he was starting to recognize. You're stuck with me either way. He didn't argue. The ship dipped toward the asteroid, slipping through a narrow tunnel lined with jagged stone. The landing bay opened into a cavernous space. Metal platforms welded into the rock, ships of every size docked in haphazard rows, and figures moving in the shadows. Aliens of all kinds, scaled, feathered, glowing, each carrying weapons or crates, their eyes darting to Sylvara's craft as it touched down with a hiss of engines. The air smelled of oil and burnt circuits, thick with the tension of a place always on edge. Sylvara popped the hatch, stepping out first, her bodysuit catching the dim light in a way that made her green skin shimmer. Ryde followed, boots hitting the ground hard, the core pulsing faintly as he scanned the crowd. They stared back, some curious, others hostile, their whispers carrying his old name like a curse. Shadowblaze. He clenched his fists, the weight of it pressing down. Whatever he'd been, it wasn't gone, not here. A tall figure approached, a Venari like Sylvara but broader, his green skin marred with scars. One ear half missing. Sylvara, he rumbled, voice deep and wary. You're late. And you brought him. His 4 eyes flicked to Ryde, narrowing. Relax, Torv, Sylvara said, clapping his shoulder. This is Ryde Tanner. Saved my ass from a Xyrak cruiser. He's got something we need to see. She jerked her head toward Ryde, a silent cue. Torv grunted, sizing him up. Heard of you. Blaze Lord. Butcher of Hector. Why should we trust you? Ryde met his gaze, unflinching. Because I'm not here to burn anything. I want this thing out of me. He tapped his chest, where the core glowed faintly through his shirt. Sylvara says you can help. Torv's ears twitched, skeptical, but he nodded. Follow me. The elders want to look. He turned, leading them through the maze of platforms, past rebels who parted reluctantly. Sylvara stayed close, her tail brushing Ryde's leg now and then. A subtle tease or a warning, he couldn't tell. Either way, it kept his pulse uneven, her presence a tether in the chaos. They descended into the asteroid's core, a chamber carved deep into the rock, lit by flickering orange lanterns. At its center stood a massive device, metal and crystal fused in strange, flowing shapes, humming with a low, eerie tone. A star forge, ancient and alien, its surface etched with symbols Ryde didn't recognize but felt in his gut. 3 rebels waited there, elders, Torv called them, each a different species, a scaled lizard man, a feathered female with glowing eyes, and a hulking figure wrapped in biotech tendrils. They turned as one, staring at the glow in Ryde's chest. So, it's true, the lizard man hissed, tongue flicking. The Blaze Lord lives. Not by choice, Ryde said, stepping forward. What is this thing? He pointed to the star forge, then his chest. And how do I get rid of it? The feathered elder tilted her head, eyes pulsing. It's a neural core, a leash forged by the HFY to bind their warlords. You were one of them, built to destroy, controlled like a machine. She waved a clawed hand, and the Starforge flared, projecting a hologram. Ryde, or a version of him, clad in black armor, eyes cold as he raised planets, fleets crumbling under his command. Shadowblaze, Blaze Lord, a god of death. His stomach twisted while rising. That's not me, he growled, but the core pulsed, dragging up memories, fire, screams, the thrill of power as he crushed his enemies. He'd loved it once. The truth clawed at him, undeniable. It was you, the biotech elder rumbled, tendrils shifting. Until you rebelled. The HFY locked you away, hid your mind in a human shell. That core's waking up, and them too. He pointed to the hologram, now showing Xyrak ships, Draxon Vile's face snarling among them. They'll kill to reclaim you. Sylvara stepped closer, her voice cutting in. Then we break it. Now, before they find us. The lizard man nodded. Possible, but risky. We need to test it, see how deep it's fused. He gestured to a sealed chamber off the main room, a medical pod glowing faintly. In there, Sylvara, you'll assist. Ryde didn't like it, but he followed, Sylvara at his side. The pod was small, barely big enough for 2, its walls lined with sensors and a single slab. He stripped off his shirt at her nod, the core's golden glow lighting the space as he lay down. She leaned over him, her green skin catching the light, her eyes intense as she strapped sensors to his chest. Her fingers brushed his skin, cool, deliberate, lingering just long enough to make his breath hitch. The air thickened, her wild scent wrapping around him, sharp and intoxicating. Hold still, she murmured, her voice low, almost a purr. She pressed closer, her bodysuit stretching tight as she adjusted the sensors, her chest grazing his. Her pointed ears quivered, brushing his jaw, and her tail slid up, coiling lightly around his wrist, a tease that sent heat racing through him. "This might sting," she added, but her eyes said something else, a flicker of hunger that mirrored his own. The sensors hummed, and the core flared, energy surging through him. He tensed, a groan escaping as pain and heat twisted together, but her touch grounded him. Firm, steady, her green skin cool against his burning flesh. She leaned in closer, her eyes locking with his, lips inches away, and the pod's glow bathed her in gold, making her look like something unreal, something he wanted to pull down and claim. "You're strong," she whispered, breath warm on his face. "Stronger than they know." His hand twitched, brushing her hip, and she didn't pull back. Her tail tightened on his wrist, a silent dare. The tension snapped taut, electric, the core's pulse sinking with his racing heart. And for a moment, the pod, the rebels, the danger, all of it faded. It was just her, green and wild, and him, teetering on the edge of something he couldn't name. The hum of the medical pod deepened, the sensors on Ryde Tanner's chest buzzing as the neural core flared brighter, its golden light spilling over Sylvara Keen's green skin. Her 4 red eyes held his, unblinking, a storm of heat and curiosity swirling in their depths. Her tail tightened around his wrist, a slow, deliberate squeeze that sent a shiver racing up his arm, and her breath brushed his lips, warm, wild, teetering on the edge of something dangerous. Ryde's hand lingered on her hip, fingers pressing into the curve of her bodysuit, the tension between them coiling tighter with every pulse of the core. He could feel it, her pull, her challenge, and he was second from giving in, from dragging her down into the fire burning inside him. A deafening clang shattered the moment. The pod's walls shook, alarms blaring as red lights flashed overhead. Sylvara jerked back, her tail snapping free, ears flattening against her head. "What the?" she started, but the comms crackled to life, Torf's voice booming through. "Xyrak breach. They've hit the bay, Draxon's here." Ryde sat up fast, ripping the sensors off his chest, the core's glow dimming but still alive, a restless heat under his skin. Sylvara spun to the pod's controls, slamming a release switch. The door hissed open, and they stumbled out into the chamber, the Starforge hum drowned by the distant roar of explosions. The elders were already moving. Lizard man barking orders, feathered female powering up the forge, biotech elders' tendrils lashing as he sealed a bulkhead. Rebels ran past, weapons drawn, their shouts echoing off the stone walls. "How'd they find us so fast?" Ryde growled, grabbing his shirt from the slab and yanking it on. The core pulsed, a warning he couldn't ignore. Sylvara's 4 eyes darted to him, sharp with realization. The core. It's a damn beacon when it activates. She cursed, snatching a plasma pistol from a nearby crate. We woke it up, and they locked on. Before he could respond, the chamber's far wall exploded inward, stone and metal flying as a Xyrak strike team poured through. Bio-armored brutes, claws gleaming, neural rifles spitting green bolts that scorched the air. Rebels fired back, plasma cracking against shields, but the Xyrak pushed forward, relentless. And then he saw him, Draxon Vile, stepping through the breach like a nightmare made flesh. His bio-armor pulsed with green veins, horns glinting under the orange lanterns, mandibles snapping as he roared. "Blaze Lord, your time's up." Ryde's blood ran cold, then hot, the core flaring in response. He didn't think, just moved, shoving Sylvara behind a console as a bolt seared past her head. "Stay down," he snapped, but she was already up, firing back, her pistol's blast lighting up her green face with every shot. "Not a chance," she snarled, her tail lashing as she ducked a swipe from a Xyrak claw. She rolled, coming up beside him, their shoulders brushing in the chaos. "You're not fighting this bastard alone." Draxon's voice cut through the gunfire, a guttural bellow. "Surrender the core, human, or I'll get your pet and drag you back in chains." He raised a massive arm, a cannon grafted to his armor humming as it charged, a sickly green glow building at its tip. Ryde's hands clenched, the core's energy surging through him, waking memories he couldn't outrun. He saw himself on a battlefield, Xyrak ships burning, his voice commanding death with a flick of his wrist. Blaze Lord. He'd crushed them before. He could do it again. Try it, he shouted, stepping out from cover, the glow bursting through his shirt like a beacon. I'll bury you first. Draxon laughed, a sound like grinding metal, and fired. The green beam tore through the chamber, slamming into the Starforge with a deafening crack. Sparks flew, the hologram flickering out as the device groaned, tilting dangerously. Rebels screamed, diving for cover, and Ryde lunged, tackling Sylvara out of the blast path. They hit the ground hard, her body pressed under his, green skin cool against his burning chest. Her 4 eyes widened, breath hitching, and for a split second, her tail grazed his back, a fleeting touch that sent heat spiking through him despite the chaos. Get off, she hissed, shoving him, but her hands lingered on his shoulders, firm and trembling. She rolled free, pulling him behind a fallen slab as Draxon advanced, his cannon whirring for another shot. Torv charged in, plasma rifle blazing, but a Xyrak claw caught him, hurling him into a wall with a sickening crunch. The elders rallied, the biotech ones tendrils lashing out, but Draxon batted them aside like flies, his eyes, glowing slits, locked on Ryde. You can't run from what you are, he snarled, stomping closer. Activate it, or I'll rip it out myself. The core pulsed, a flood of power begging to break free. Ryde felt it, raw wild, a beast clawing at his ribs. He could unleash it, burn this place to ash, end Draxon here and now. But Sylvara's voice cut through, sharp and close. Don't. Not yet. We need you alive. Her hand gripped his arm, green fingers digging in, grounding him. He met her gaze, for eyes fierce with something beyond fear. Trust, maybe, or a desperate hope. Then what? He rasped, the core's heat searing his chest. He's not stopping. She yanked him up, dragging him toward a side tunnel as Draxon's cannon fired again, blasting the slab they'd hidden behind into rubble. We run, she said, voice tight. The elders can hold him. We get to the core lab. There's a way to break it, but we need time. Ryde followed, boots pounding the stone, the chamber erupting behind them in fire and screams. Draxon's roar chased them, a promise of death, but Sylvara's grip on his arm was a lifeline, her tail brushing his leg as they ran, a fleeting tease in the madness. The tunnel narrowed, twisting deeper into the asteroid, and the core pulsed with every step, a ticking bomb he couldn't silence. They burst into a smaller room, a lab, cluttered with tech and glowing vials, a single console blinking in the dark. Sylvara slammed the door shut, sealing it with a hasty override, her breath ragged. Here, she said, pointing to a scanner rigged to the wall. Plug into core's data. If we can overload it. Overload it. Ryde cut in, stepping to the console, the glow spilling out as he ripped his shirt aside. You mean kill me? Her 4 eyes softened, just for a moment. No, free you. But it's a gamble. She moved closer, her hand brushing his chest, cool against the burning core. You ready to bet on it, Shadow Blaze? He stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. Freedom or slavery, life or death. Draxon's footsteps echoed closer, a thunder growing louder, and the core flared, a choice he couldn't dodge. Do it, he said, voice steady. I'm not his puppet. The lab-sealed door trembled as Draxon Vile's heavy footsteps echoed closer, each thud a hammer against Ryde Tanner's resolve. The small room, cluttered with glowing vials and blinking tech, felt like a trap closing in, the air thick with the tang of burnt circuits and Sylvara Keen's wild, earthy scent. Her green hand hovered over the scanner, for red eyes locked on Ryde, fierce and unyielding. You sure about this? She asked, voice low, her tail flicking nervously against the console. The neural core in his chest pulsed, a golden glow seeping through his torn shirt, alive and restless. No choice, Ryde said, stepping to the scanner, his jaw tight. He's got us pinned. If this thing's a leash, I'm breaking it now. He pressed his chest to the device, the core's energy humming as it synced, a sharp sting racing through him. The console flared, data streaming across the screen, schematics of the core, its ties to the HFY bang, a weapon and a cage fused into his flesh. Sylvara's fingers flew over the controls, her ears twitching as she worked. It's deep, wired into your nervous system. Overloading it could. She stopped, two eyes flicking to him, softer now. Could kill you, or set you free. No guarantees. Ryde met her gaze, the core's heat burning hotter. Better dead than his slave. He nodded to the door, where Draxon's roar rattled the walls. Do it. Before she could, the door exploded inward, metal shards flying as Draxon Vile stormed through. His bio-armor gleamed, green veins pulsing, horns casting jagged shadows under the lab's flickering lights. Too late, Blaze Lord, he bellowed, mandibles snapping. You're mine. A Xyrak squad followed, claws slashing, rifles spitting green bolts that scorched the walls. Sylvara dove behind the console, firing her plasma pistol, a bolt searing a Xyrak's chest. Ryde moved without thinking, grabbing a jagged metal rod from the debris and swinging hard. It cracked against a merc's skull, green blood spraying as the core flared, power surging through his arms. He fought like a man possessed, every strike precise, brutal, a shadow of the warlord he'd been. Shadow Blaze. Blaze Lord. The names burned in his mind, fueling him as he ducked a claw and drove the rod into another Xyrak's gut. Draxon charged, cannon arm whirring, and fired. The green beam tore through the lab, shattering vials and bursts of glass and light. Ryde rolled, the blast grazing his shoulder, pain searing as he hit the ground. Sylvara shouted his name, leaping over the console, her tail lashing as she tackled a Xyrak pinning him. Her green body moved fast, fluid, a blur of fury and grace, and she yanked him up, her hand gripping his arm tight. He's got me, she hissed, her eyes wide with panic as Draxon loomed closer. The core, they'll use it. Not today, Ryde growled, shoving her toward a side hatch. Go, I'll hold him. She hesitated, tail brushing his leg, a fleeting touch that sparked heat despite the chaos, then nodded, diving for the hatch. Ryde turned, facing Draxon, the core blazing like a sun in his chest. Come get it, you bastard. Draxon laughed, a grinding roar, and swung a clawed fist. Ryde ducked, the blow shattering a wall, and lunged, slamming the rod into Draxon's cannon arm. Sparks flew, the weapon faltering, but Draxon grabbed him, lifting him off the ground, claws digging into his shoulders. You'll serve the collective, he snarled, green eyes glowing. Or die screaming. The core pulsed, a flood of power begging to break free. Ryde felt it, raw, wild, a beast he could unleash. He could burn this place, end Draxon now. But Sylvara's face flashed in his mind, her trust, her fire. He wouldn't be their weapon. Not again. With a roar, he drove his knee into Draxon's chest, breaking free, and bolted for the hatch Sylvara had taken. He slid through just as Draxon's cannon fired again, the blast sealing the tunnel behind him in a collapse of stone. Darkness swallowed him, the core's glow his only light as he stumbled forward, finding Sylvara at a small docking bay. She stood by a battered shuttle, her green skin streaked with dust, her eyes blazing as she waved him in. Move, human. He's right behind us. They piled in, the shuttle's engines coughing to life as Sylvara punched the controls. The craft lurched, bursting from the asteroid as Draxon's cruiser loomed outside, its spines glowing with a fresh charge. He's got my scent, Ryde said, gripping a rail as the shuttle shook. That core, it's calling him. Then we take the fight to him, Sylvara shot back, her voice hard. His ship's got a docking port. We crash in, hit him head on. Last chance to break that thing before he owns you. Ryde nodded, the core's heat spreading through him, a fire he couldn't outrun. The shuttle screamed toward the cruiser, dodging green bolts, and slammed into a docking bay with a crunch of metal. They spilled out, weapons drawn. Sylvara with her pistol, Ryde with the rod, and ran into the ship's guts, a labyrinth of biotech corridors pulsing with green light. Xyrak guards swarmed, claws slashing, but Ryde fought through, the core fueling every move. He smashed a merc's face, ducked a rifle blast, and kept moving, Sylvara at his side, her tail flicking as she fired. They reached a massive chamber, a fighting arena, its floors scarred with blood, walls lined with energy coils. Draxon waited there, towering in the center, a cage glowing behind him. Sylvara's silhouette trapped inside, a hollow trick to lure him in. "Welcome, Blaze Lord," Draxon rumbled, cannon arm charging. "Your pet's mine. Surrender, or she burns." Ryde's blood boiled, the core flaring brighter. "She's not your bait," he snarled, charging forward. Draxon fired, the green beams searing the air, but Ryde dove, rolling under it, and swung the rod. It cracked against Draxon's leg, staggering him, and Ryde leapt, driving it into the cannon's barrel. The weapon sparked, backfiring in a burst of green fire that sent Draxon reeling. Sylvara burst from a side tunnel, not caged, a decoy, her pistol blazing as she joined him. "Nice trick, you ugly bastard," she shouted, firing at Draxon's chest. The warlord roared, swinging a claw that caught her, hurling her into a wall. She hit hard, slumping, and Ryde's vision went red. "You're done," he yelled, the core exploding with light. Energy surged through him, golden and wild, a power he'd wielded as Blaze Lord, enough to raise worlds. He grabbed Draxon's arm, twisting it back, and slammed his fist into the warlord's chest, cracking bioarmor. Draxon staggered, mandibles snapping, but Ryde didn't stop. Punch after punch, the core's power fueling him, a storm breaking loose. Draxon swung again, knocking Ryde back, and raised his cannon, green light building. "You can't win," he snarled. "You're theirs forever." Ryde hit the ground, chest heaving, the core's glow blinding now. He saw Sylvara stirring, her green form struggling to rise, and something snapped inside him. Not theirs, not Draxon's, not the HFY bangs. His. He pushed up, the energy coiling tight, and roared, "I'm no one's slave." He charged, ducking the cannon's blast, and tackled Draxon, slamming him into an energy coil. The impact sparked, the coil overloading in a shower of light, and Draxon howled as bioarmor melted under the surge. Ryde stepped back, panting, the core pulsing wildly. Draxon slumped, wounded but alive, green eyes glaring. "Finish it," he rasped, "or they'll take you anyway." Sylvara stumbled to Ryde's side, her hand gripping his arm, her eyes fierce. "Don't," she said, voice rough. "Not like this. Break the core. In it for good." He looked at her, then the core, its light a storm in his chest. Freedom or power? Life or chains? He nodded, turning to Draxon. "You lose." With a final surge of will, he focused the core's energy inward, ready to shatter it, and everything it bound him to. Ryde Tanner stood over Draxon Vile's crumpled form, the Xyrak warlord's bioarmor sparking and smoking, green blood pooling on the arena floor. The neural core in his chest roared, a golden storm begging to be unleashed, its power a heartbeat away from consuming him or freeing him. Sylvara Keen gripped his arm, her green skin cool against his burning flesh, four red eyes blazing with a mix of fear and fire. "Break it," she urged, voice raw from the fight. "End this now." He nodded, the decision locking into place. No more chains, no more Blaze Lord. He closed his eyes, focusing the core's energy inward, a tidal wave of light and heat surging through him. Pain ripped across his chest, sharp and blinding, but he held on, teeth gritted as the glow intensified, flooding the chamber. Sylvara stepped back, shielding her eyes, her tail lashing as the energy pulsed outward. With a final roar, Ryde tore the core apart, not with his hands, but his will, shattering its hold. A shock wave erupted, golden and wild, slamming Draxon into the wall and frying the arena's coils in bursts of sparks. The core's light faded, leaving a hollow ache in his chest, and Ryde stumbled, knees hitting the ground. He was free, human again, no god, no weapon. Sylvara rushed to him, dropping beside him in the wreckage, her green hands cupping his face. "You did it," she breathed, her eyes searching his, her ears trembling as she leaned in. Her body pressed against his, firm and warm through the bodysuit, her tail coiling around his waist, a tight, possessive grip that sent heat spiking through him. She kissed him hard, lips fierce and wild, tasting of dust and victory, and he pulled her closer, hands sliding over her curves, the tension of the fight igniting into something raw. Her skin shimmered under his touch, green and alive, and her breath hitched, a soft moan vibrating against him as the world faded to just them, two survivors in the ashes. Draxon groaned, still alive, but the fight was gone from him, his armor a ruin. Ryde broke the kiss, panting, meeting Sylvara's gaze. "It's over," he said, voice hoarse. She nodded, tail lingering on him, a promise of more as they rose together, leaving the warlord behind. 3 years later, the twin sons of Alara dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and violet. Ryde Tanner stood on a beach of shimmering blue sand, the ocean lapping at his boots, a cool breeze tugging at his hair. The scars on his knuckles had faded, but the memory of the core, of Shadow Blaze, still lingered, a quiet echo he'd learned to live with. Beside him, Sylvara Keen stretched out on a blanket, her green skin glowing in the twilight, her red eyes half closed as she watched the waves. Her bodysuit was gone, replaced by a loose tunic that clung to her curves, her tail swaying lazily in the sand. They'd built something here, a small settlement on this emerald planet, a haven for rebels and outcasts who'd fled the HFY's crumbling grip. Ryde turned, looking at the huts dotting the shore, the laughter of kids and the hum of a generator blending with the tide. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, freedom carved from the chaos. Sylvara sat up, her ears twitching as she caught his gaze. "You're brooding again," she teased, voice soft but sharp. She slid closer, her tail brushing his leg, a familiar tease that still sparked heat in his gut. "What's on your mind, human?" He smirked, dropping beside her. "Just thinking. 3 years and no chains. Feels good." He reached out, tracing a finger along her green arm, her skin smooth and cool under his touch. She leaned in, her eyes glinting with mischief, and her tail coiled around his thigh, slow and deliberate, pulling him closer. "Good's an understatement," she murmured, lips hovering near his. "You're mine now. No HFY, no Draxon. Just us." She kissed him, softer this time, a lingering heat that built as her hands slid under his shirt, nails grazing his skin. He groaned, pulling her onto his lap, her body fitting against his like they were made for it, green and human, wild and steady. Her ears brushed his jaw, tickling, and her tail tightened, a playful squeeze that made him laugh against her lips, the sound swallowed by the dusk. A faint beep broke the moment, a comms device blinking in the sand. Ryde sighed, reaching for it as Sylvara nipped his neck, a warning not to stop. "What now?" he muttered, scanning the message. His face hardened. HFY's regrouping. New fleet sightings near the outer rim. Sylvara pulled back, her eyes narrowing. "Let them come. We've beaten worse." Her tail stayed on him, a tether, and her smile turned wicked. "But tonight's ours. They can wait." He grinned, tossing the comms aside. "Damn right." He rolled her beneath him, sand shifting under them, her laughter ringing out as he kissed her again, deeper, the heat between them flaring like a star. The sun sank fully, stars winking to life, and a voice whispered in his mind. Not the core's, but his own. Freedom's worth fighting for. And her.